I visited for you for the color. You say you send me a picture, but I cannot find that color. So I want you to go through these, what color you want it to the cabinet. There's a lot of colors in there.
This is for the painting?
For the painted the cabinet.
For the cabinet? Oh.
Yeah, if you send me a gray, blue gray color. I just wonder if you,
Right here.
The covenants is
Let me come in there.
I'm going to show you.
These guys are coming in, but I can't have noise at this time. Can't have noise because I'm lecturing. So for an hour, I can't. They have to work without saw or something like that. It's not possible. I'm on the air. Hello again. Picking up the narrative. Oh, before we get there, your work is due today, and you need to upload it to Unlearn and also send it to my marker, Stephanie Serino. It's one word at gmail.com. Are there any questions? Good. Okay. I want to do another review question before we look at the Roman Empire at its height. Here you see the Roman Emperor. We'll be discussing this afternoon. We're doing 16, the review question 16, which is what was the role of warfare in Greek society? And to answer this question and say that, to begin with, war was a fundamental institution in classical Greek civilization. The fact that this civilization was organized on the basis of separate city-states meant quarrels, conflicts between them on a continuous basis. War was a constant, and therefore, as I said, war became institutionalized. And these wars were fought with the foundation of it was basically the citizens of the city-state, in order to be citizens, were required to be soldiers. So over time, the dependence on these citizens fostered the development of what we consider to be Greek democracy, with all of its limitations. But nevertheless, the fact that the citizens were at war and that gave them citizens' rights eventually turned into democratic government in the most advanced Greek city-states. The second aspect of what war produced was, of course, slavery, because those who survived the wars, who were losers, became slaves, and slavery became, as I underlined, a fundamental institution in Greek society. Now, having said those important things, we can also note that the Persian Wars, 490 to 480, which the Greek city-states won against Persia, the great empire, played a big role in the Greeks' sense of their own identity, their own superiority and their confidence in their way of life, including their culture. Then one should note the Peloponnesian War, which involved many, if not most, of the Greek city-states, either on the side of Sparta or on the side of Athens. This war resulted in the ruin of many of these Greek city-states, never recovered from the result of so much destruction. On the other hand, the thing is that war had become so institutionalized And in the context of economic decline and a steady increase in population, basically young men selling their services in war, or in other words, becoming mercenaries, that became common practice. And the proliferation of soldiers selling their military skills, basically, and the pressure of this led to the expansion of the Greeks into the Persian Empire, and ultimately the conquests of Alexander the Great. That's fundamentally the answer to that question. Now, looking at, we're turning now, unless there are further, there might be some questions. Is there anything that people want to discuss?
Hi, this is Sarah Gates. Sorry about that. This is in relation to the essay. Just to clarify, do we need to send the essay to the marker as well as the midterm
Yes,
test?
Learn and the marker.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, so we're today looking at the empire, the Roman Empire at its height. Of course, it had been forming for a very long time, but here we see, following the collapse of the Republic, under the Principate, the early emperors, 1st and 2nd century, we see the Roman Empire at its very height. And you can see that it extends, well, England in the north, not Scotland. The border with Germany, Germany is, or Germania as it was called, these were German tribes located here outside of the empire, but you can see that France is included in the empire. And then this is the trace of the Rhine River, and then the Danube River rises in the same area. It's basically the Alps, and it runs along here, and that becomes it runs into the Black Sea. That is the frontier, the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, you see, in Central and Eastern Europe. Then you see the Caucasus and part of southern Russia is occupied by Rome. The Caucasus, what is today Turkey, Iraq. This is Persia here on the right, the Persian Empire, but Mesopotamia, cradle of civilization, it's all Roman, and Egypt and North Africa. So this is an enormous empire. As I said, 50 to 60 million people living in it. And it represents the unification of the ancient world. What kept the empire together in the first instance was the Roman army, which at its height, you're looking at between 400,000 and 500,000 men. There weren't going to be armies as large as this, really until I would say the French Revolution, 1789, the armies of this size, or maybe Louis XIV, a century earlier. But these armies were enormous. So you had this Roman army and its camps all over the empire, especially strategic points along the frontier. You had a very large, unprecedentedly large bureaucracy, of course, centered in Rome, but there were bureaucrats all over the empire, basically giving justice or collecting taxes. who held things together. And you could say that the bureaucracy was remarkably efficient in the sense that they had the tax records of all the subjects of the empire were basically collected in Rome. So, in order, well, this was an enormous amount of data, and it was controlled and manipulated by these bureaucrats. It does show a kind of an effective government. They also had the records, of course, of the soldiers in the legions. So you can see that the setup was impressive. Now, so you have the bureaucracy, you have the legions, but also the Romans undertook, once they consolidated their empire, an enormous road building program. And they built roads all over the empire to unify the empire, and in particular to make the movements of the Roman legions as easy as possible. And these roads, as a matter of fact, are the basis of the European and the Middle Eastern road systems. Even today, the roadbeds, obviously been built over, but the roadbeds established by the Romans are still there. So they built these roads extremely well. So that also helped to unify, aside from the bureaucracy in the army, you have these, the system of communication. And of course, the fact that the heart of the empire is the Mediterranean, and travel by sea is a lot easier than by road, also helped to unify most of the empire. Obviously, the Middle East is a different story, but nevertheless, the Mediterranean, of course, was very important. Now, also extremely important was the fact that over time, and this would be starting in the 2nd century BC, already under the Republic, but continuing for the next 400 years, you have the fact that there was a Romanization of the empire. Roman culture spread, and the elites, I'm not talking about the peasants or the poor townsmen, I'm talking about the elites in the Roman Empire, the people who had the merchants, the officials, the people of influence, the landowners. These people were Romanized. By the end of the 2nd century, they considered themselves to be they identified as Roman citizens. And there was a progressive Romanization. And so you see, as I say, the notables, the landowners, even the chieftains, certain lands which were relatively backward, still were organized on a tribal basis. For example, in England, there were tribes, Celtic tribes. Likewise, in Gaul, this was also Celtic and was Spain. Well, these tribal chiefs and the headmen in these essentially still tribal societies were Romanized. Their children went to Roman schools, and they themselves began to look upon themselves as Roman. Now, the rule of the Romans was not particularly harsh. I mean, fiscal pressure was a reality. Obviously, the main thing that they, once they had regularized the empire, collecting taxes and sending them to Rome was absolutely the key function. But they let these many cities and towns all over the empire, and I believe there were something close to 200 towns and cities in the empire, they allowed them a large measure of self-government. And likewise, the Celtic tribes in Spain and Gaul and England, the tribal leaders were able to, they were left alone for the most part by the Romans. The Romans basically ruled indirectly, one could say. Now, and I've mentioned this earlier in earlier lectures, this issue of who was a Roman citizen was really quite important because you had all sorts of rights and privileges as a Roman citizen that you did not have if you were not a citizen. And what Rome did as it conquered this whole territory, it extended Roman citizenship basically to all of the elites of the empire. These tribal leaders up in Gaul or in Spain or in England, or these Middle Eastern landlords, essentially all became Roman citizens. And even, it's interesting, in the New Testament, of course, Paul is very important in terms of the development of Christianity, but we know that when he was arrested by the Romans, he claimed, well, he said, I am a Roman citizen. And that was important in terms of him defending himself. And he was aware of that. So being a Roman citizen was quite important. Now, this sense of the general spread of Roman, sort of the sense of being Roman, is reflected even in Rome in the Senate in the 1st century AD, the 1st century of the Principate. The Senate, of course, is now, it doesn't function really. It doesn't function effectively as an independent political entity. It's controlled by the emperor, but there was still a Senate. And what's notable is that the Senate was made up of people who were not Italian. The majority of the senators came from other places in the empire, marking the fact that the sense of being Roman had spread all across the empire. Now, so there is this Romanization, this culture, Roman culture, and Roman sort of sense of Roman citizenship spreads all over the empire to the elites. But as an essential element in this sense of Rome, of being Roman, is also being the recipient or the heir of Greek culture, because the Romans considered themselves to be the protectors of the great achievements of the Greeks who had preceded them. That was one of the justifications for the empire. They were not only spreading their own Pax Romana, but they were also spreading Greek, or what we call Hellenistic, values. This also, this sort of mixing of Roman and Greek elements as the kind of culture of the elite is an essential characteristic of the empire at its height. Now, this process of the spread of Hellenistic culture, the literature, the way of life of the old Greek city-states had already begun in the Hellenistic period, following Alexander the Great, as I explained in the earlier lecture. The Greek culture spread into the Middle East and so on. And there was a kind of mixing of the East and West already during the Hellenistic periods, and the Romans basically carried this on. They just carried on this process that had begun in the Hellenistic period. The fact of the matter is that anybody who was a Roman, a member of the Roman elite, as I've defined it, basically had a Greek education, and you needed to be able to speak and to write in Greek in order to be considered an educated man. We're not considering women, because women, if they were fortunate, would have access, but most of them did not. In any case, the elite was both Roman and Greek, if you like, and especially that was true in the eastern part of the empire, that is to say, Greece and all the way to Mesopotamia. But I would say that is a general characteristic of the elites. They went to school and their education was both in Greek and Latin. And so it's this general culture which spreads amongst the elite. And I'm not talking about the common people here, because the common people did not share in this culture. They were ignorant of it. And it was a fundamental class point of class separation, whether you had such an education and such an outlook or not, or you merely belonged to some local group or tribe and you were impoverished and you had this excluded you, you were marginalized, and so on. Now, let me see if I can. Yes. The Romans, when Roman intellectuals and sort of literary people got together, what did they speak about? What were their goals and so on? Well, they wanted Roman culture to achieve the same things as the Greeks had. They admired what the Greeks had accomplished, and the goal of Roman writers, of creative people, was to basically imitate and equal the level of literary culture that had been achieved by the Greeks. And so one of the big themes of Roman literature is basically we're emulating, we're respectful of the Greeks, we're emulating them, and possibly we're their equals. And so you do see, I don't think you can say that the achievement of the Romans in this respect was up to the level of the Greeks in the classical period, in the period of the city-states, but nevertheless, they did produce some very great poets. And here I'm listing three of the most important. Ovid, Horace, and Virgil can be considered the three great poets of ancient Rome. And they did produce a historian by the name of Livy, who basically wrote the history of the Roman Republic in many books. And he's considered to be on the level, I wouldn't put him up there with Thucydides, but he's a very good historian, I would say, of that type. I mean, it's basically political history that we're dealing with, but nevertheless, he wrote beautifully and he had a respect for the facts, which are important to doing history. Now, so one of the themes was emulating and possibly equaling the Greeks, but also another theme of their literature, of the Roman literature, was how can we get back? Rome is corrupt. We know it's corrupt, but how can we get back to the virtue, the virtues, the morality of our forefathers. This was a very big theme. There's a kind of nostalgia for the sort of moral strength of the republic. Uh, this idea of going back to the roots, going back to the way of life of the forefathers who were all virtuous. This is a common theme in the literature. And the two of these things, the emulation of the Greeks and also the veneration of the ancestors, bespeaks a culture that is not interested in really creating something new. It's a conservative culture we're talking about. The Roman Empire is ruled by essentially a conservative patrician class, and they're not interested in sort of the great new breakthrough in literary experimentation and so on. No, their self-expression is inherently conservative. The attempt to democratize the empire had been defeated with the defeat of the Gracchi, and this landlord class ruled now, the patricians, and they wanted to preserve what the past, and they wanted to preserve their own power. Now, I'm speaking a little bit more about their achievements. What did the Romans achieve? Well, when you look at their art, when you look at we do have their mosaics and their paintings, many of them, and we also have their sculpture. It's mainly an imitation of the Greeks. This confirms what I've just said. They're basically, it's imitative. It's simply following the footsteps of the Greeks. The only area we can say that there was any originality in Roman art was the artists would, and it was lucrative, if you were a distinguished man, you would like to have a bust of your head and face made by a sculptor. Maybe some of you know that row of distinguished citizens of Winnipeg that you see in Assiniboine Park as you enter the park from the southern entrance. I think some of you probably know this spot, and so on. You pass it as you whiz by on your bike. Well, that's what the Romans liked. That's one of the things they liked. And some of these busts show the faces are done with a certain originality, and they are inherently quite interesting. I would say that that was the best thing that they could come up with. In philosophy, again, it's all Greek. They study in their schools Plato, Aristotle, Epicureanism, and Stoicism, all Greek philosophies. There's little or no innovation. The only areas I would say that the Romans really showed a certain originality or a certain achievement which separated them, which distinguished them, was first of all Roman law and Roman engineering. And you could see how this might follow from the fact that they had this huge empire, that the legal system, the laws, were very important to the administration of the empire. So Roman law became, the interpretation of it became extremely important. And so you see from as early as the 2nd century AD, there were certain lawyers who spent their time sort of studying and analyzing the body of law. And this gradually developed into a very great body of jurisprudence, as we call it, the law, the body of the law. And all of this was brought together by one of the last Roman emperors. He reigned in the first part of the 6th century AD. His name was Justinian, and he ordered the drawing up by these scholars of the Code of Justinian, Justinian's Code. And this text became the basis of law in the West. This was passed on, it survived, and it became, for all of Europe, it is the basis, except maybe for England, it is the basis of the legal system that survived the fall of the Roman Empire in the West and was embodied in modern law. And the second achievement in this respect was engineering, so important to the building of roads and bridges and great monumental buildings. Engineers played a big role in building these roads, but they also built aqueducts, that is to say, these gigantic structures that ran over miles from the sources of fresh water from the mountains and so on down to the cities. There were these huge raised structures which carried the water from the purity of the mountain streams down into a city like Rome or into a city like Nîmes in southern France, a Roman city. So aqueducts. But the Romans also built stadiums, temples, arenas, and monuments of all kinds, especially commemorating their great military achievements. And engineers were very important to planning and executing these buildings. And of course, slave labor, because there were hundreds of thousands of slaves, millions of slaves, were the labor force which built many of these structures. But that having been said, we can say that to the credit of the Romans, that they were superb town planners. New towns were built, and they were laid out in rational grid systems, quite rationally organized and so on, the markets, the temples, the stadiums, and so on. And in building, the Romans invented the use of concrete. The Greeks knew nothing about it. They built in stone. The Romans, concrete is a kind of a mixture. I can't go into it. The base of it is basically sand. They learned how to build in concrete. And furthermore, they invented, going beyond the Greeks, they invented what we call the arch and the vault. In other words, covering buildings. They built, the arch, but also the vault. The vault, using the arch as the base, they were able to cover large spaces. And this is so the arch and the vault are Roman achievements. And they paid a lot of attention to sort of the interior space and to proper lighting within the interior space, to keeping out the bad weather and so on. The Greek temples were largely open to the elements, but the Romans learned how to cover large spaces, is what I'm saying. I've mentioned the slaves, and I should say a little bit more about them. Many slaves came, the word slave comes from Slav comes from slave, and the Romans got a hold of a lot of people living in Eastern Europe, Russia, and so on, and made them slaves. And they also enslaved, of course, a lot of Africans or many of their enemies in the wars that they fought. Germans, they all became slaves when they were captured. So the Romans drew, and of course, the elites depended, the elite economy, the plantations and so on, depended on the slaves. And therefore, it was an ominous thing when the population began, instead of increasing, it began to decrease. Who would do the work became a question. I'll have more to say about that in a little while. Now, in addition to these slaves, there were large numbers of people living in the cities, and especially Rome, who were unemployed. There was no work because the cities, there was some manufacturing, there's some craft production was going on in the cities, including Rome. But for the most part, the cities were inhabited, the landlords lived in the cities, the government officials lived in the cities, and basically they exploited the slaves and peasants who were producing the wealth of society, was being produced by the slaves and peasants, and the city elites basically they enjoyed the benefits, but there was only slight development of craftsmanship and industry. In other words, the ancient cities, and this is true of the Greek cities in the old days as well as the Roman cities, were parasitic on the countryside. They didn't give anything back. It was a novelty of modern times, of the 16th century, way out, we're looking ahead, that we see that the towns produce things that people in the countryside could buy. But that was not true in antiquity. There was, the cities, as I say, basically fed off the surpluses taken from the countryside, and there was a basic antagonism, I would say, as a result. But in the cities, in addition to these elites who were enjoying all the amenities, there was a large number of people who did nothing. They were unemployed. They were, as they're called, lumpen proletariat, or rag. Lumpen is the word for rag in German. They did nothing. They hung around. They were the mob, and the elites were afraid of them. In Rome, there were over 1 million people, and these people, this mob could riot. They could start burning down the homes of the wealthy people. And so the state was concerned about controlling these people. And of course, they used force, but they also provided what were called bread and circuses. Bread and circuses, that is to say, entertainments, in the form of course, gladiatorial contests. You've seen Gladiator and so on, the movie. Yes, that this was very popular amongst people. Seeing people actually fighting to the death was pleasurable to the Roman mob, and likewise, forcing some individual to fight a tiger or a lion was also enjoyable. And so there would be these wild animal fights that went on as well. While the elite, of course, they went to these things, they enjoyed it as well, but they also they went to the theater. They were more refined. They went to the theater, they banqueted, and so on. This is the sort of pleasures that the elites enjoyed. And taking up from the Greeks, the cities, including Rome, were filled with all kinds of public buildings like theaters and the Roman baths. People went to the baths on a weekly basis. Arenas, stadia, forums where there would be sort of public discussions and so on. These were some of the most important buildings in the towns. And it was a kind of the culture, it was, as I come back to the theme, was a combination of Greek and Roman culture. Now, so that gives you a sort of an overview of many aspects of the culture of the empire at its height. But I would say that religion plays an important role as well. We should discuss religion under the Roman Empire as well before we move on. And I would say that, and this is a theme I've spoken about when I spoke about the Jews and I spoke about the Greeks. That's to say, religion was an important political and public affair. Religion was not simply a private matter. And paying homage to the official religion was a sign of loyalty, and it was required of people to do this, just as it had been was the case amongst the Jews, the temple, and also in the time of Socrates in Greek culture. The state depended on the political religious allegiance of the citizens, in other words. Now, in the religion of the Roman Republic, there was a civic religion in Rome under the Republic, and it continued under the emperors. I would say that the priests were basically official functionaries. This is what their role was. And indeed, some of the magistrates, some of the judges, some of the executives in the state would have priestly functions. There was a kind of overlap between politics and religion. And then, of course, when the emperors emerged in the first century, there was established the cult of the emperor. The emperor actually, as I said, he became Pontifex Maximus, and there was an official cult of the emperor. And if you had business with the state, you had to prove your loyalty to the state by basically expressing your religious loyalty to the emperor. And this, of course, became a problem for the Christians, who in principle rejected any such idea. And as a result, they were continuously suspected. As a result, this was one of the issues between the early Christian church and the Roman state, which was important. Of course, that's and of course at the local level, the old temple cults of the Greek city-states, or the religious temples of the Egyptians, or the temples in Mesopotamia, they continued. All of this went on. Although it was more or less formalistic, as I would put it. It was kind of, you went to these things on some sort of family or civic occasion, but you didn't take it too seriously. On the other hand, there were all these other cults, people that had developed in the Hellenistic period, more personal forms of religion, mystery religions, astrology, fortune telling, augury. I explained what that was. There was an important new religion that emerged in the period of Roman Empire was Zoroastrianism, which came in from Persia. And this was a religion which basically, it was partly a philosophy, partly a religion. It held to the idea that the world was basically based on a continuous struggle between darkness and light, good and evil. It was what we call a dualistic view of reality. And um, this was sort of the thing that determined the outcome of things, the struggle between good and evil, or darkness and light. But there was also, there were a lot of mother cults, worship of the mother. And who doesn't worship their mother? You have to be sick not to worship your mother. And so it was easily, it could become the basis of all kinds of fertility cults, mother cults. So you have the cult of the Great Mother, you have the cult of Cybele, you have the cult of Isis. This was all part of Roman religion. Now, I explained that the Roman Empire, the Principate, the emperors, this all developed out of this conservative republicanism that we talked about last week. The conservative elites who were centered on the Senate of Rome were determined to exclude the people from government. And the class conflict marks the whole of the history of the Republic down to the time of the Gracchi. And the murder of the Gracchi was the end of that particular class conflict between essentially the rural farmers and the landlord class. But revolts did continue. There was resistance, and perhaps the greatest of these resistances, these revolts, came in 73 BC. We're still in the Republic, when all of the slaves in Sicily and in southern Italy, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, under the leadership of this obscure slave, Spartacus, revolted and marched on Rome. And it was a near thing. The Republic almost fell to this slave revolt. And of course, there is this quite good movie with Kirk Douglas. I guess you can get it on YouTube. I don't know whether they have a fee on it. Spartacus. There was that revolt. And then we see that, for example, in England, under a Celtic queen by the name of Boadicea, in 66 AD, there was a serious revolt against Roman rule. The Romans had conquered England, but there was a rebellion. And then in the middle, on the middle Danube, south of the Danube River, in a region known as Pannonia, there was another important revolt. But the greatest of these revolts, the greatest challenge, aside from Spartacus, that the Romans experienced were the problem of the Jews in Palestine, because they revolted twice in 66 and again in 136 AD. The Jews in Palestine revolted. I should say that most of the Jews actually at this point lived elsewhere, and I would say a majority of the Jews were now living in cities all around the Roman Empire. They had become a diaspora, and many of them had become merchants. But in Palestine, that was not true. There were peasants. The majority of Jews were peasants, or were farmers. And this is, of course, the context in which Jesus emerges, and we will be speaking about that in the next class. So I will see you on Wednesday. Have a very pleasant afternoon.